In this chapter, we will dive into the evaluation of public policies related to SDGs. And I will focus on 3 of the main targets of the SDG 15, which are first, halt, deforestation, and ecosystem degradation, which is essential given the fact that we're close or we have already passed some planetary boundaries. Second, there is a need to promote sustainable management of both terrestrial ecosystems and inland freshwater ecosystems. And third, the target of securing fair and equitable benefit sharing, especially for the poor. And I will draw on my experience when I was State Secretary for Environment and Sustainable Development of Amazonas for this, because the state is the largest state of Brazil. It's about 2.5 times Texas. It's larger than the Democratic Republic of Congo or Colombia or Indonesia. So it's very, very large. And it's 97% forests. So looking at these 3 main targets, how can we assess progress of public policies related to those very important and very clear outcomes? Well, first let's look at deforestation. Deforestation had a peak in 2003, and we were able to implement a number of policies that resulted in a very sharp reduction of deforestation rates since the onset of this program that we call the Green Free Trade Zone, Zona Franca Verde. And as you can see in this graph, this is a very clear indicator of the outcomes that were part of the intention of these policies. And the short message is that this very relevant outcome was a result of a combination of policies and not simply law enforcement. Because oftentimes people think that in order to reduce deforestation, you simply need to have more police. And that's not how we did it, and that's not how I think is the most promising approach. We have to invest in changing the mindset of people, the values. People have to see forests as worth more standing than cut. This was the slogan that we crafted in the beginning of this program, and eventually was borrowed by the federal government of Brazil and other states as well. But this is simple but extremely profound, so that people look at forests as an asset rather than an obstacle to implement agriculture, which is how people in many parts of the world, and especially in Latin America, see forests. So promotion of sustainable forest management. Sustainable forest management in many parts of the world is very bureaucratic. So the approach, in my view, is conceptually wrong, is to make more difficult through paperwork requirements rather than through good and simple management practices. So the first thing we did was to simplify the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy, I mean paperwork. That was a requirement of 33 documents to get a forest management plan approved formally. And this is basically impossible for the poor and for those who are in remote areas without access to institutions that can issue those papers. So we simplified it, So that was number one. Number two, we created an organization, which was an agency of forest management, to provide the technical assistance, because agricultural organizations had zero programs on supporting forests and fisheries management. And as a result of that, we had a great number of small forest management plans formally approved. And these actions resulted not only in making it legal, but also in providing technical assistance to improve silvicultural practices, and also cross-sectoral policies such as tax incentives, such as education for forest management and fisheries management, and other initiatives that helped a positive agenda towards forests. So I think it's very important to look at positive incentives for forest management rather than simply punishment and law enforcement. The third target that I want to illustrate in this chapter is the benefit sharing mechanisms. It's very important to empower politically those sectors of society that live in forests. Usually indigenous peoples, traditional populations, and poor farmers have a power deficit. And they have a power deficit not because they're stupid or ignorant. No, it's because, first of all, it's very expensive to come to town to press local policymakers at the municipal level, at the state, and much less at the federal government. So because of this challenge of logistics, these people don't get their voice heard. So in order to secure empowerment, or in order to enhance the empowerment of these forest peoples, we did a couple of things. One was an annual conference of indigenous peoples. We created an annual conference of traditional populations, which in the case of our landscapes here are different, indigenous and traditional populations, and also an annual meeting on environment. And this was an initiative that brought to the capital city, in our case Manaus, representatives of these groups which had this power deficit that I mentioned to you. And this was very effective in order to have an opportunity to dialogue with the highest level of policymaking at the state level. And the indicator for this is the number of conferences, the number of participants. So it's important to assess all of these targets with clear indicators. Of course, having a number, you simplify things, but as the good textbook in management says, what you don't measure, you don't manage. So it's important to measure. And of course, it's important to do also qualitative assessments of these policies so as to assess their effectiveness and efficacy. Let me close this by discussing some of the management tools that we have used. In addition to the conferences that I mentioned, we created councils. We had a council on traditional populations. We had a council on education for indigenous peoples. We had a council on environment. And these were special venues which were convened by the government, but were comprised mostly by civil society leaders. And that was a way of creating the empowerment that I referred to. And that is a way of securing equitable benefit sharing. Another management strategy that we used was external evaluations. We had a very important evaluation at the first period of 4 years done by an independent international organization, CEPAL, which is the Economic Commission for the Development of Latin America, based in Chile, and was extremely positive, the whole process, not only the publication that you can find in our platform, but it's made a series of recommendations on how to improve it. So having a serious, rigorous, independent assessment of public policies is a very useful tool. And finally, annual reports. We produced annual report every year with numbers, with description of policies and program. And this is also very important to communicate. Our final message is on the need of having accountability and transparency and communication of results so that the evaluation is done by the society as a whole, not only by an external evaluation by experts, but also something that the society as a whole can look at it and make their own judgment, criticism, and suggestions to improve it. Because it's an imperfect construct, public policy. It's a construct in the making that always needs to be improved. So it's essential that the debate is based on well-informed data and analysis so that the different stakeholders can make their political analysis, their opinions, and foster a constructive debate.